Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. So, today we're diving into a really fascinating journal entry from Notes on Fishkeeping. We're going to look at how a totally mundane, everyday weekend chore unexpectedly turned into this incredible, real time lesson on aquatic biology. If you've ever tried to maintain a hobby in a space that's, well, less than perfect, or if you're just fascinated by how resilient nature can be when we least expect it, you're absolutely going to love this breakdown. Let's get right into it. Section 1. A surprising weekend discovery. From chores to a fish-keeping surprise. Okay, let's dive into this. The author of our source material, Ang, was slowly bouncing back from an illness over the weekend and figured, why not catch up on some housekeeping? The plan was to declutter the outdoor edge ponds. It was a pretty straightforward goal, right? Just clean up and check on the pond's population since the fishes were out and clearly visible. But right in the middle of this totally routine cleanup, Ang stumbles upon a complete biological surprise. Tucked away inside this old terracotta pot, a bonded pair of polar parrot cichlids had quietly laid a brand new batch of eggs. You can literally feel the micro-suspense of this exact moment. Ang was just washing down an old, leaking EPS foam box and a terracotta pot. I mean, imagine the sudden, super relatable panic of scrubbing a pot only to realize that you might have just disturbed a delicate, newly formed family of cichlids. Ang actually notes a very real, very stressful concern over whether scrubbing the pot would ruin the eggs' chances of survival. So, acting fast, Ang carefully relocated the brooding pair and their eggs up to the backyard balcony, just to give them a safe, quiet space while the rest of the decluttering happened. Moving on to Section 2, Environmental Triggers for Spawning. Happy Biological Accidents. Let's move to how this builds, because finding those eggs is really only half the story. The real question here is, why did these cichlids decide to breed in that exact pot at that exact time? To figure that out, we need to quickly ground ourselves in the actual biology of the moment. Spawning in aquatic animals isn't always just some random event. It's actually very frequently triggered by sudden, distinct environmental shifts. In the wild, things like heavy rainfall, which causes a rapid drop in water temperature, basically act like a giant biological alarm clock. It tells the fish, hey, it's the perfect resource-rich time to reproduce. And this brilliantly illustrates the core mystery of our story. Look at the pure accident of the situation. That EPS foam box Ang was cleaning out had actually been slowly leaking water for a while. To keep the pond functioning, Ang had just been regularly topping it up with fresh tap water. But think about the biological effect of that action. By constantly pouring in fresh, cool water, Ang was totally accidentally mimicking rain and sudden temperature changes. This perfectly simulated natural phenomenon is almost certainly what triggered those polar parrot cichlids to spawn. Literally, just a completely happy biological accident. Section 3. Managing the next generation. Alternate environments. Now, what's really interesting about this next part is how it highlights a real logistical challenge for fish keepers. The new eggs are safely relocated, sure, but a surprise like this means you suddenly have to manage a rapidly expanding population. And Ang solved this spatial problem super creatively. Turns out this wasn't actually the very first time Ang cichlids had spawned. There were already several older juvenile fishes swimming around from a previous spawn. So to make room and make sure everyone survives, Ang took those older juveniles and introduced them into an outdoor pond that was already full of guppies. It was a really clever relocation that provided a viable, completely alternate environment for those older fishes to safely grow up in without overcrowding the newer generations. Section 4. Ideal versus reality tank setups. Working with what you have. This clever little shuffling of fish brings us to a massively important takeaway for anyone in this kind of hobby. There is so often this huge glaring gap between what the textbooks tell you to do and what you actually have the physical space to pull off. For instance, in the world of fish keeping, once your fish breed, you are ideally supposed to have a dedicated grow-out tank. Basically, this is a much larger, totally separate aquarium whose only purpose is to give juvenile fish the vast amount of space they need to safely grow into adulthood. So the crucial point here is that clash between the textbook ideal setup and everyday reality. Ideally, yeah, you want a smaller, separate breeding tank and that massive dedicated grow-out tank we just talked about. But doing that usually requires a proper, dedicated fish room. Ang's reality, like a lot of us, is limited home space. This physical constraint forces both the breeding and the growing out phases to happen within the exact same tank environments. Now, Ang mentions that somewhere down the line, if a proper fish area or room becomes available, that dream setup might finally happen. But for now, you just stick to whatever arrangement you can actually manage. And that brings us to a fantastic concluding thought for this explainer. While we're all out here waiting for our ideal setups, whether that's the perfect fish room, a bigger workshop, or a better office, nature just keeps finding a way. Think about it. A leaky foam box and some fresh tap water were literally all it took to spark new life inside an old terracotta pot. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How often is nature adapting and thriving right under our noses in our beautifully imperfect everyday environments? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep an eye out for those happy little accidents in your own spaces.